How does nonprofit entity work in a profit real estate setting?
It's kind of mad. The interesting thing is when you take profit out of the motive, you can actually deliver on sustainability, community and affordability. The funny thing is that some developers don't value design. Yet they all drive nice cars. And the reason that they drive those cars is because there has been an incredible amount of design put into that. We can measure our thermal efficiency, we can measure our energy consumption, we can measure our indoor air quality, but how do we measure whether the community is working?
Jeremy McLeod saw a housing crisis taking over his city, more profit-driven, less livable, and out of reach. So he asked, what if architects, not developers, took control? He raised $2.7 million from 27 friends, bought land, and built something radically different. That was Nightingale Housing's first project. Today, there are over 20 across Australia, and more than 21,000 people are waiting to get in. Coming up on Most Modern, we talk on what it takes to turn a bold idea into real change, and whether this model could work in your city.
Most Modern.
Welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks very much, Minkoo.
I want to start by going back to when Nightingale Housing first came into being. What was happening in the housing landscape in Australia that compelled you to take that leap?
What happens in the development cycle is that we sit under a developer with the capital, under a development manager, under a project manager, and frustratingly, more recently, under a real estate agent. Under that model, it's very, very difficult to make changes because it's always looking backwards, what's sold, for how much, and let's replicate that. It's all about managing risk. So at Breathe, we were, doing some projects, trying to have impact and kind of winning on some sustainability initiatives, but really having to fight hard with the client to be able to get those through, but really not making that much headway. For us, we finally decided out of frustration that in 2007, we bought our own site as an architecture firm. We all worked as architects, and I still work as an architect at Breathe. And I think that if you think about Breathe as the band and Nightingale Housing as one of the albums, I think that's probably the best way to think about it. So we bought a site thinking that development can't be that hard. Spoiler alert, it's really hard. But we bought the site in 2007 and we wanted to build the type of housing that we'd seen our friends living in Sweden and Berlin. This idea that you could build housing that was simultaneously sustainable and affordable, and through sustainability of reductionism, you could share things in the building, rather than building this individual requirements for everyone, and so you could build community and affordability at the same time.
So Jeremy, you're hinting that in Australia that wasn't the case when you were starting the project.
No, I mean, that's the weird thing, Alex. That prototype project was called Nightingale. We started 2007. We get to about 2011, and I couldn't secure debt from the bank to build it. They're like, an architect wants to build a housing without air conditioning in Melbourne, without car parking? Absolutely not. We're not going to lend money to that. And so I ended up begging an impact investor to come and essentially bail the project out and finish the project for us. Mm-hmm. So an impact investor called Small Giants came and funded the project on the way through, took the project over. Anyway, when we finished that building, we thought all it was based on precedents that we'd seen our friends living in Stockholm, and that it wasn't particularly special in the international stage. We finished that building in 2013, and in 2014, that same building that would be ordinary in Stockholm or in Berlin won the National Award for Housing and the National Award for Sustainability. I was actually quite shocked by that, and it was up against a Jean Nouvel building with this big artwork on top of it that was incredible. And I think the artwork cost the same amount as our entire building. And our building won the national award. And when I spoke to the jury after the awards ceremony, I said, how could the Commons, these 24 apartments, have possibly won the national award for housing? And they said, when we came through your building, it wasn't just the sustainability. All of your residents seemed happy. I mean, oh my God, how sad is that for architecture and design and development if we're not achieving that as architects, right?
It's definitely not something you ever really, for whatever reason, it's not a metric that you follow up on later, to be honest, as architects.
Well, it's hard to measure. We can measure our thermal efficiency, we can measure our energy consumption, we can measure our indoor air quality, but, how do we measure whether the community is working? And so lots of people are talking about the measurement of, social impact, but it is actually hard. Anyway, so when we finished the Commons, so started as Nightingale, completed as the Commons, the idea was that we would build this one building and that we would use it as a prototype to show our developer clients that we don't just have to build apartments for investors, that we can actually build apartments for community. We can build apartments as housing, not as an asset class. And so we finished the building and then we started opening it up for tours, and we took every developer in the city through it, which was really interesting. But our developers said, that's very interesting. Thank you for that. But it's a blip on a radar. It's not a trajectory. So we don't see things actually changing. So thanks for that. Interesting. But no, we'll just keep on doing business as usual and sell to our investors offshore. And then we can bring that back to Australians and we'll just keep on treating housing as an asset class. It's fine. And then this interesting thing happened. We had Open Houses Melbourne, which is in July in Melbourne. So in that year, it's a cold, rainy day in Melbourne, which Melbourne can have miserable weather. On that day, I didn't think, I thought maybe 20 people might turn up to see an apartment building. And then they opened up the Commons. I went downstairs at 10 o'clock to run a tour through the building. And there was a line down the street, And the volunteers from Open Houses Melbourne are saying, I think we need to see if we can open up some more apartments. So anyway, I called all the people in the building because I was living in the Commons at that time with my wife. And I called some of my friends on different floors and said, can you guys come and help with the tours? In the end, 6 other apartments ended up opening up their houses for tours that day.
Wow.
And 1,016 people came through the building in that day. And all of those people were just Melburnians. I think that the apartment stood for something. That the place had a clear vision, right? It was about sustainability, it was about community. And I think that people knew intuitively that living, without your own car park downstairs and with a shared beautiful laundry on the rooftop, that they knew it was going to be more affordable to buy into. But I think that it was actually that the place meant something. Generally apartments, in Melbourne anyway, have been built for investors. It's just curtain wall and that there's a tick box, how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, how many car spaces. You tick the box and you sell historically in Melbourne to offshore investors in Southeast Asia or to moneyed Australians in Sydney. Mm-hmm. The good city. I think that we got, after that day, 11 people wrote to us and then it was 42 people. And then we're like, well, we can wait for developers to do another one of these things, or perhaps we should just do it ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so if developers didn't see that as a trajectory rather than a blip on the radar, then we're just like, okay, well, let's do it ourselves. So I bought the site across the road from the Commons and I didn't have enough money. We bought it with money that we owed the Australian Taxation Office, but I was confident, I was optimistic that we would be able to make it all work. So I had to pay that money to the tax office. I had 3 months to do that. I used that money as a deposit. And then I wrote a call to arms to some of the best architects in the city. And basically I wrote this manifesto about Nightingale Housing, about the idea of the democratisation of capital, that we as architects needed to draw a line in the sand and we needed to take a position which was about building housing. And so I sent this call to arms to about 40 architects in Melbourne, and 6 of those architects wrote back to me. Like one of them wrote back to me within 15 seconds.
Wow.
So Simon O'Brien from 6 Degrees, like literally the minute I'd sent the email, he must have just skim read it and wrote back and said, yes, I'm in. And so I asked everyone to invest $100,000 each, that we would build the next Nightingale building, that we would control the capital, that the architect would lead the project, that the small-scale shareholders would be investors in a triple bottom line housing model that would be equally about sustainability, community and affordability, and that we would cap the returns on that investment at 15%.
Could you explain a little bit more about what triple bottom line housing is?
So for any of you out there that have read Let Your People Go Surfing, it's by Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia. But Patagonia, for me, has been a guiding light of how to run a meaningful company in capitalist times, right? So you can operate within capitalism and you can still do it ethically. And so the 3 bottom lines are, 1 is the financial bottom line. It has to make financial sense. Otherwise you can't compete and can't exist. So we accept that. The second one is sustainability. So if you cannot build a sustainable product and the planet can't sustain us, then there's no point doing anything. And then the third one is about humanity and community. You want to make sure that whatever you do does not massively disadvantage some other unseen cohort of people on our planet. And so for us, we use that framework from Patagonia to say, let's build a housing model that represents that. So Nightingale, we call a triple bottom line housing model. So it has to be affordable, but it also has to return risk-adjusted returns to our investors. Mm-hmm. And so historically, investors would want a 25% return on equity in developments, and we cap the returns on Nightingale at 15%. But we say that in doing that, you get to invest in something that's sustainable. You get to do something that's important about building community in your city that you live in and that you love. And importantly, we think it's a risk-adjusted return, because if you deliver housing that is delivered more affordably, arguably it's more easy to sell. If you deliver housing that is more sustainable, arguably it's easier to sell. If you deliver housing that delivers on the promise of community, it's easier to sell. So we say to our investors, you can expect less return, but we're not going to have sales risk. We're not going to have settlement risk. Our residents are buying this as their home, and we're going to be able to do that, and we're going to be able to sell them housing more cheaply because we're just going to be honest and open about all of the things that we're doing and all the things we're not. So we don't have any real estate agents, we don't have any marketing teams, we don't build display suites that are scale inaccurate. Instead, we just have information sessions. We talk openly and honestly with our residents. And all the money that we save from the sales and marketing process, we just take off the price of the housing. So our investors are satisfied that they can take a reduced return because they think that the sales risk is reduced.
Have you ever wondered why housing is so expensive, why traffic never improves, and why new buildings all look the same? If you're trying to make sense of how the built environment actually works and what could make it better, make sure to subscribe to Most Modern on YouTube or your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. If today's discussion resonates with you, give us a like, drop a comment, share the episode, and help us push the conversation forward.
What's interesting with Nightingale is that you are a nonprofit developer. But how does nonprofit entity work in a profit real estate setting?
It's mad. I mean, it seemed like it made so much sense at the time. But what's been really interesting is as a not-for-profit, we haven't been able to build a balance sheet, which I think has inhibited the scale. So why a not-for-profit? I think that for us, the problem with housing in Australia, and, I've spent some time in the States, gentlemen, and I've got to say that, as bad as it is in Australia, it is infinitely worse in the States. And I'm sure
we all agree.
I'm sure to the converted here. And I think that, for me, spending time in the US and then in Vancouver and then coming back to Australia, what it looks like to me is that Canada is following the US and Australia is following Canada. So it feels like that we are going to arrive at the same place that you are with. I think that the last time I was in LA in 2022, there was 70,000 people sleeping on the streets of LA. For context, that's the size of our fourth biggest city in Victoria, the state that I live in. So that's what a housing delivery system driven by profit has given the US. And if we don't do something drastically different in Australia, that's what we are going to be left with. So Nightingale, while Nightingale is not about profit, all of the people that work in the project, so the people putting in their capital, the equity partners, they make profit, right? So they put in money at 15%, they make profit. The builder comes and builds and he might put in a 6% margin and he makes a profit. The architects come in and put in a fee, and they get paid at the end and they make a profit. The interesting thing is when you take profit out of the motive, you can actually deliver on sustainability, community and affordability. And so we push in our development feasibility, we push the cost of finance above the line. So it's a project cost. And then we build in to be able to get debt. So we put debt in as a project cost. But to be able to get debt from a bank, from a not-for-profit that doesn't have a balance sheet, it's very difficult. And so we build in a contingency. So we obviously have a number of contingencies in our project, but when we get to construction, the bank wants to see not a 5% construction contingency, but a 10% construction contingency because we don't have a balance sheet.
I
So
see.
if we're building a $80 million building, we need $8 million of contingency in our feasibility. Through the project, we might spend 3% of that contingency on variations or latent conditions or whatever that is, but we might still have $5 million left in that. Historically, after Nightingale 1, that contingency that was left over, we gave back to the residents. So we wrote a check back to the residents and said, in Nightingale 1, we had $109,000 left, and we just wrote a check for $109,000 and gave it back to all the residents, equally.
Nice moving gift.
Yeah, right. Really stupid. Because now, fast forward, what we all know is that your operations are only as good as your last development. And through COVID, we bled. Like our government was shutting down construction sites, mid-cycle, we were paying $440,000 in peak debt on one of the projects where the government shut down. Like, it was horrific. During those projects, all the contingency that was left was either chewed up through COVID, through those delays, and whatever was left over was put back into topping up investor returns to make sure that none of our investors, while we weren't giving them back 15%, we were making sure that they were getting as close to the 15% as possible. Because if we can't give them their money back, or if people lose money, then we're never doing another Nightingale, right? Because
Exactly.
our name will be mud for investors, and what we've learned is that we need capital to build. So, but yeah, ideally, Minkoo, in an ideal world, what we would now do is that if we deliver a project, we've got leftover contingency, that leftover contingency would go back into the Nightingale balance sheet so that we can build a war chest, so that in the event that something like COVID ever happens again, or if we've got a problem with a builder going into liquidation, we've got the capital to be able to finish that. But at the moment, Nightingale, has no balance sheet. It runs on the smell of an oily rag, and I've got a relatively high appetite for risk, but I've got to say it's pretty spooky some days. So I think that Nightingale is too brittle as an organisation at the moment, and it needs some financial assistance, I think, to be able to build a long-term resilient model that can exist into the future.
For sure.
Sounds like a developer, right?
Yeah.
Those are the things people don't necessarily think about. I don't think any of us would have thought about those things when we were trying to get into development in the first place, right? Like, it is a long game, and it's risky too. It's something that as architects we don't necessarily appreciate.
Alex, leading up to COVID, we just didn't think we could lose. Like, I was just like, this development thing's not that hard. Like, it was just a boulevard of green lights. And then 5 projects we had running through COVID just became impossibly difficult, tenuous, and like, it was just like, I felt like Neo on the rooftop just dodging bullets, going, I'm only millimeters away from, that's it, it's all over. So it got way too spooky, even for me, through COVID, to be totally honest.
Yeah, I mean, that's why most of the developers are risk averse, because one development goes south, you lose your shirt. Like, it's very hard to recover from one failed development.
Yeah, correct. And I think that, for Nightingale, because we currently are funding each project by project, the minute that we lose someone's money, it's going to be impossible for us to raise capital again.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how many we've done before, but, yeah, I think that's right, Minkoo.
Nothing's easy.
Ideally, we do ask people, now that we're a charity, but we do ask people to put in concessional fees for us, because we're delivering 20% of our housing to social and affordable housing. And again, that might not seem like much to, your sophisticated listeners, in New York, that know that there should be inclusionary zoning with housing projects. But in Australia, there's no inclusionary zoning. So for us to put in 20% voluntary affordable housing, like, that's a hard thing for us to do in a feasibility. The problem with local government democracies sometimes is a lot of residents, privileged residents in particular communities, having a right to their say, but also under our planning system, a right to veto a planning permit and then take you to the appeals tribunal, which turns a planning process into a legal process.
Yeah, so your experience with NIMBYs then. I guess, you had talked, Jeremy, about your appeals to your investors, how you basically grow a pie so that everybody can eat from the project. What do you say to the community members who don't necessarily have a financial interest, but have maybe a sentimental or a political or in many cases, actually a financial, they feel like there's a financial interest in maybe one of your developments occurring in their neighborhood versus somebody else's? Well,
Alex, you and I both know that, for anyone out there that's, my parents' age, I apologise, but it seems to be significantly baby boomers who bought into Melbourne, in the 1980s, so bought into the suburbs that we're working in for houses that were about $40,000 at the time. Those houses are now worth about $6 million, and they have big houses with lots of off-street car parking, and they're quite comfortable, and they don't really understand that how the housing crisis is unfolding here. That 10 years ago it would have been preposterous to think that we had a homelessness issue in our city or in our country, and at the last census there were over 116,000 people who were homeless in this country, one of the richest countries in the world, I might add. And they can't imagine a generation that have grown up with an iPhone and Uber who don't need a license, who have never got a license, and so shouldn't be forced to build a car park costing $100,000 in the basement of their building when what they actually need is housing. So yeah, the NIMBY thing is alive and well here. I've got to also say that the YIMBYs have popped up since, and there's a couple of young guys in our city that are leading this YIMBY movement here, and they are supremely energetic and absolutely terrific and not afraid to have a fight. So it's been great to finally see people saying yes, because the problem is with people with privilege who haven't ever actually spent time with people on the other side of the coin, they don't understand how desperate it is.
Yeah.
And whereas I'm sure if they spent time with a 35-year-old, nursing graduate who's been couch surfing for nearly a year because he can't afford to rent a place while he's working at the local hospital. You know what I mean? If you got to meet them and you'd say, oh, actually, we should really try and find a way to get this kid housed.
So you talked about how bad the housing market is, and I just want to get some more context around it. So in terms of sales prices or rents, in Boston, like the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment is $3,000 per month. The average for a condo is more than $650,000. In relation to that, how is the housing market in Melbourne right now?
Well, importantly, Nightingale was established specifically to help people buy housing, secure housing. It's what's called the Great Australian Dream. In the 90s, the government of the day said that every Australian should have the right to own their own home. And in 2000, our Prime Minister changed some tax laws, which gave capital gains tax exemptions. So tax exemptions to people who would own more than one home. And since that time, since 2000, the proportion of the population that own two or more homes has increased by 20%. And the proportion of people buying a home magically has decreased. Their first home has decreased by 20%. And of course, that's been divided generationally. So the people that had housing at the time, the baby boomers, have now got multiple houses, and millennials and people aged under 35 have not got housing. So this incredible demographic, upset in the last 20 years or 25 years. So Nightingale exists to help people buy their own home. That's the idea. That rather than being another community housing provider that gets government grants to house people at the bottom of the cliff, we try to park the ambulance at the top of the cliff.
Right.
And so how has access to housing prices shifted in the last few decades? When my dad bought his house in the 80s, it took you about 2 years to save for a deposit. When I bought a house in the 90s, it took about 4 years to save for a deposit. And now when my daughter wants to buy a house, it takes 10 years to save for a deposit. And what happens, of course, is that to save a deposit across 10 years, the house price just keeps on stretching away from you. So and so what's happened is that the current generation have given up on owning housing, and they've accepted this badge that's been given to them as digital nomads, which I don't think they necessarily want that, but they're just like leaning into that, saying, well, what's the point of saving anymore? I may as well spend my money, go to Bali and try and live my life for as long as I can. But we've got, if I look at what's happening with the graphs at the moment, like demographic graphs around housing, I think we've got about 40 years till we have more than 50% of our people that aren't owning their housing. So at the moment, 70% of people own their own home or are buying their own home. And it looks like in 40 years' time, it's going to be less than half our population owning their own home, which I think that sort of stuff is the stuff that leads to civil unrest.
Right.
The separation that NIMBYs seek also works against them in trying to humanize the relationships between the community that you're actually trying to build up. I feel like it's like pushing a rock uphill. But to that point, Nightingale Housing is known for the ability to develop community within the project. I'm wondering how that manifests. How does that come about, either from the financial side, the planning side, or the design side?
Yeah, okay. Good question, Alex. I think also we don't just try to foster community within the building. We actively try to engage with existing communities. And I've got to say that while we have had problems with NIMBYs, we've also had incredibly supportive neighbours. I mean, there's a woman called Catherine that lives in the middle of what let's call it the Nightingale epicentre. She lives in this 100-year-old house that's kind of relatively run down with her 2 cute kids and her husband. And we've built, like 700 apartments around her. Mm-hmm. And I see her on the street. Her kids are out on the street with the pogo stick. They come to all the street parties. They talk to everyone. They're actually, and they watch the community grow. And there's loads of those people that have welcomed Nightingale into their community, even though there's been construction and noise and all of that disruption. But they've seen it as a good thing, because she cares about the city and the community, and she can see that it's good for everyone, including her kids. So, it's not all doom and gloom. It's generally the people that actually never get into it that don't understand it. But how do we build community? I mean, again, Alex, it's anecdotal rather than, we don't have a lot of hard data on this. The interesting thing is that our approach to sustainability and our approach to community, I think, are intrinsically linked. So let's talk about the building itself first. So we approach sustainability through a sustainability of reductionism. So what can we take out? Like if we've got a rigorous mantra about if we don't need it, let's take it out. And if we can share it, let's share it. So what I mean by that is Nightingale Village, when we bought it with an existing permit, and then we went back and re-prosecuted the permit and changed the design. Mm-hmm. But the existing permit came with over 200 car spaces worth $9 million in the feasibility. We designed out those 200 cars and instead replaced it with about 450 bike parks and then 14 share cars. We then worked with the share car company to make sure that everyone in Nightingale Village got a free car share membership worth $360 a year. And then we negotiated hard with them to get driving rates for our Nightingale residents at the same as the Go Get staff. So Nightingale residents now get access to 14 share cars in their basement. And, and we designed what those share cars look like. A couple of EVs, some hybrids, an SUV, a car with roof racks, a car with a baby seat, a moving van, a ute, what you guys might call a pickup truck.
You know what a ute is, yeah.
The ute is, a little hatchback.
Classically Australian.
Yeah, that's right. So all of the different types of cars you need, by not having a car space, we saved everyone about $100,000 per apartment by not digging all those basements. But at the same time, we gave them incredible utility in all the different cars they could have at incredible driving rates. So we've got that. And then great sustainability, right? So, putting it all in the basement and we've got 14 cars instead of 200 and all that carbon that we didn't build in the concrete. So that's an interesting idea about sustainability of reductionism. If we think about the laundries in the building, we take out 203 individual laundries and instead we build 6 rooftop laundries for the 6 communities. We broke that 203 apartments into 6 communities, each with its own core, each with its own rooftop, each with its own laundry. And the laundries are beautiful, great, highly efficient, washing machines, and there's a bank of 10 of them there. Beautiful rooftop garden, all this great hanging space on the roof, well lit, well ventilated, and great kind of views over to the other Nightingale buildings and out to the city. So we don't put penthouses on the roofs, we put laundry on the roof. But instead of, a laundry or a European laundry in an apartment would normally cost us about $6,000 or $7,000 to build. But it also takes about, 1.5 square metres out of your living space, right? Right. So suddenly your living space gets a little bit bigger, your apartment gets a little bit cheaper, and then we build this killer rooftop laundry. What historically people would think is a utilitarian space. I lived in the Commons for 7 years with my wife. My wife's highly introverted, and we met everyone in the laundry. And we made lifelong friends at the Commons. And it's interesting that those utilitarian spaces where everyone's just got to go to do their thing, and it doesn't matter whether you're an architect or a teacher or a nurse, you're just doing your thing. And over time, it kind of breaks down barriers because it's not that awkward, right? You're all doing something. There's a reason to be there.
It's such a smart design move, I wanted to say, because when we think about a laundry room in the US context, in New York or in Boston, like they're very dark spaces that's tucked either on the basement or somewhere deep near the core. You were saying that you're romanticizing it, but I think laundry rooms need to be romanticized because it needs to be designed better.
I've never been in a good laundry room, come to think of it, which is a shame. Like, why not?
Okay.
And you're totally right. I mean, I think the best laundry room that I ever experienced was when I was in college, and it was in the dorm. It was a cruddy place. It didn't, but at least you had that feeling of being all together. The moment you move into private residence and you're an adult and you're, you have your own privacy, you feel like I shouldn't really interact with people. But I do feel like if you made it nice, if you made it a place you wanted to be and hang out, it could totally change the vibe.
Well, I also, like if you're introverted or you're extroverted, you don't want to engage, you can use it 24/7, So I knew a couple of young guys that were game designers living in the Commons, and they would go overseas, and then when they would come back, they'd have all of this stuff to wash. And they would go and do it on a Tuesday night when they know that anyone wouldn't be there, and they'd take 7 washing machines. They'd do it all in one go because they didn't want to annoy everyone else. We knew that the parents with kids, they knew that weekdays when everyone else was at work, that was the time to do your washing. And the people that wanted to engage with their neighbours would go and do it on a Saturday or a Sunday when everyone was doing their washing. You can do it at different times and engage when you want to, but I mean, that's an interest. So we save on carbon. Think about it in the Commons, for example. Instead of having 24 washing machines, 24 troughs, 24 ton dishes, 48, taps, instead we've got one rooftop laundry with, 8 washing machines, a handful of troughs. And then we spend some money on seating some shelves for like a little temporary library, a beautiful bench top and a view to the city in a rooftop garden. It's a much better spend, much less carbon and community builds. How else do we build community? We ask the lift company to set the lifts on the slowest setting possible. So our buildings are generally relatively low rise, so about 6 stories. And so what that means is that if you're able-bodied, you take the stairs, right? Because you can't be bothered waiting for the lift. If you've got a pram or a shopping trolley or you're on crutches or you've got a walking frame, you wait for the lift and that's fine. And the lift comes to you pretty quickly because it's not being used that much. On the stairs, we make a couple of spots for people to stop on the way so you can move slowly. We make sure the stair has access to open light and ventilation, that it's a nice place to walk so that it's an opportunity to save energy. We only have one lift, but also encourage human health and interaction in that. We'll build in moments of pause in the building, so we try to slow people down. I think that, the other interesting thing about taking cars out of the building is that everyone walks into our building through one point, right? No one's arriving in our building in a basement and then coming in through a lift and arriving on their lift lobby. Everyone comes through the front door. And so by the front door, we'll have a seat, a notice board, a chalkboard for people to write stuff. It's very interesting going through Nightingale communities and seeing the stuff that people put up there. It's very cute. Different communities have different things. In one of the buildings, there's a kid that does dog portraits. And so goes and takes photos of people's dogs and sticks it up there. It's just like good stuff like that. There's a seat near the mailboxes. And then from an urban design point of view, we call that out onto the street. So we hold our building line back. It might be by 600 mil or it might be by 2.5 metres. We create slightly raised planter boxes, which also work as seating edges around the fronts of the building, so that people can meet people, wait for an Uber, or just sit out the front of their building and talk to their neighbour before they go in. But all of that happens at walking pace, so no one's driving in and out of our buildings. They might be walking their bicycles in, but it's all happening at walking pace. That's the important thing. Just trying to slow people down and give them the opportunity to just say hello.
I feel like these are all design decisions that would only come from an architect. Maybe we're just 3 architects here who would think that way, but they're definitely not the types of decisions that would appear as positive on the pro forma, let's say, or they wouldn't be driven if it was just purely for profit. So obviously, Jeremy, you're an architect, either through Breathe or through with your other design collaborators, you're coming up with these ideas. But where do the tensions appear when you're actually trying to develop them? And then my other question is also, how do you maintain and how do you make sure that those things keep on functioning once you've finished the project?
Yeah, okay. Well, can we come back to how do you maintain it later? That's a really interesting question. And also, as architects, we love control. Actually, let's talk about that first, right? So, Yeah, obviously, when we first imagined this thing, it's very, very hard to let go. But what I've spent a lot of time doing in the last 5 years is just writing some good, solid governance pieces into what we call the Owners Corporation rules. I'm not sure what you call it in the States, but it's the rules that govern the operation of the building.
Sure,
Yeah,
like
condo documents.
the bylaws. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the bylaws. Yeah. So the interesting thing. So what have we done, and how is that important? And then how do we let go? So, and maybe let me talk too about the interesting thing about Nightingale Housing and why it's been so successful. I think from a sustainability or a community point of view is because sometimes there are things you can't solve through drawing a building. And I think that's the frustration as an architect, right? You have all these ideas and we say, this is how I want to solve it, but we don't actually have the tools to actually make systems changes. And I think that the commons for us was when we thought as architects that the answer was in design and building. And Nightingale is when I understood that actually if the system is broken, you have to design a new system. And so Nightingale is meant to be an entire system. And so to design that system, it's not just designing the building and the seats and the laundry. It's actually about designing how the finance flows, but also how you run the ballot process, or how you allocate the social or the affordable housing, or how you write your housing policy, like who are you balloting to, who's on your priority ballot list. But importantly, what happens in those Owners Corporation rules or the bylaws that will actually represent the building for the next 100 years, and what will the building do? And so let me just tell you about a couple of the key things that we've written into those. So, and why it's so important. 39% of our carbon problem on this planet, of our carbon emissions, comes from the built environment. Of that, about 2/3 is operational carbon currently. And so opportunities, that's the easiest thing to solve. The problem for us as architects is that we don't decide whether, like generally I'll specify in a building that it's got to be 100% electric. And then I'll have a development manager and a real estate agent say, oh, no, we want gas cooktops. And so they're designing gas in when we know that there's no pathway to net zero if you're designing gas in. And I'm working on projects in 2025 in Australia where I'm being told by real estate agents and development managers to design gas in. And as an architect, I'm refusing to do it. But at Nightingale, the fundamental thing is you can't design gas into it, but it has to be 100% electric, right? But then the next big thing as architects that generally we can't have impact on is where are the electrons being bought from? And in Australia, there's still coal-fired power plants, right? Same in the States, right? So if we're not specific about where the electrons are coming from, people are buying electricity from coal, right? It's a terrible emitter. So instead, we write, rather than trying to design a super efficient, low embodied carbon building, we just write into the Owners Corporation rules a couple of really simple things. So one is the building has to be powered by 100% renewable energy, and we write that in. And it becomes very, very difficult for the future residents to ever change that. So people coming in know that. So it means that, and then we ask that the building has to undertake an annual carbon audit. And so that becomes the responsibility of the residents to do that. And so as the residents come in, we knowingly tell them all that. They know that that's what they're coming into, and that becomes their responsibility on the day of handover.
It's amazing that as a private entity, you're pushing all those envelopes forward, where in the US now, like some progressive states like Massachusetts, for example, is championing on the sustainability as a requirement by requiring every new construction being 100% electric moving onward. And they also have to meet a passive house standard on the design side. And effectively on July 1st, like the net zero carbon will come into effect. So that's how hard we're going policy-wide.
I'm laughing because I wish in Australia, it's interesting, like the Federation of States in the US, how different the states are, but that's incredible.
So what I'm interested is, like you are doing it and it's not a requirement. Now that you've delivered several buildings, do you see any change in the capital market or the lenders or the investors side that wants to do that type of projects, acknowledging the need and the demand for it?
No, absolutely. I mean, when we started this, the idea was that we would build the commons and it would be used as a way to change the market, like seen as a prototype building that would help inspire developers to change the way that they did things. And it didn't work, right? I think that with Nightingale, when we delivered Nightingale 1, I think the development industry sat up and looked and said, this is interesting, this is another one of these things. But now that we've done about 20 buildings, that our waiting list has grown from 42 people to 21,000 people,
Wow.
We sell...
Now it's a market.
Yeah, now it's a market. And like, when we sell apartments in a relatively flat apartment market in Melbourne at the moment, we sell apartments through a ballot. So during COVID, we sold $60 million worth of apartments in an online ballot through Zoom without a real estate agent. It's incredible. And so now that we're doing that, everyone is sitting up and looking and saying, wow, there is actually a market for this. And so, and look, the great thing is that we've proved to the market that you can do 100% electric apartment buildings and it's not hard. And so now in the state that we are in, Victoria, the state government, to their credit, have now outlawed gas in all new buildings.
Oh, so you're now influencing the government.
Well, I think
they see the impact.
Well, I think that they always wanted to do it, but I think that there were powerful lobby groups saying that you couldn't do it. And we continually proved that you could. That other developers, there's some beautiful boutique developers here that are now doing 100% electric, and they're meeting our environmental standards. So historically, you only needed to do a 5-star energy rating. So unlike Passive House, 5-star is like 5 stars out of 10. It's like 50% energy efficient. And we've always delivered 7.5 stars. And so now there are a whole bunch of developers in Melbourne, in our jurisdiction, delivering on all of our sustainability standards. 7.5 stars, 100% electric, committing to 100% renewables, the Owners Corp rules. So for us, they're like, incredible things. Also, we've totally shifted the dial on car parking. We've been running this conversation with the city and with the state since 2009 that housing provisions and car parking provisions in the planning scheme have to be uncoupled, that housing is a basic human right, and that car parking is a luxury or a privilege. And at the moment, we have to focus on housing. And that, especially now, given that the cost of and construction of car parks is over $100,000, but also we all know as architects, the carbon cost, of pouring concrete into the ground that isn't circular. There's no end-of-life use for a basement car park. Well, maybe a nightclub, with a low ceiling or something, or maybe a mushroom farm. But it's a high carbon way to build a mushroom farm. So we have to be thinking drastically differently about that. And, Alex, you're based in San Francisco, right? Last time I'm there, Waymo's driving around in like the future of cars is rideshare subscription service, right? It's not privately owned vehicles parked in strata titled, car parks. Like it just seems insane to me that people can't see that.
Yet the conversation when you go to a planning meeting is always, we're going to build these apartment buildings. Where am I going to park my car on the street? What's going to happen? And I think what's remarkable of what you've done, Jeremy, and your colleagues at Nightingale, over the course of almost 2 decades, you've demonstrated that there's alternatives. And that seems to always be the fundamental problem with the built environment, that people can imagine potential solutions, but they need to see it happen before everyone gets on board. And just by a factor of the time and the resources that it takes to actually produce a building or a space or a place, it's going to take a while for us to see those returns. But what I'm incredibly impressed with is that you're not just taking the design solution, you're really thinking about each and every system, the inputs and the outputs, how it affects the user experience, how it can be sold, but also how it can be sustainable. All of these things together, which I would love to do, but I think I have to say it is really impressive how you're able to think through all these sorts of things. And so one thing that I do want to ask about is, how do you learn from your projects? Because as you mentioned, you're up to 20 buildings by now. I'm sure there's mistakes you made at the beginning that are affecting how you think right now.
Yes, lots. I think that since the start of COVID, and I'm sure it's been the same in the States, what we've seen is construction prices have gone up 42% in our city.
Same here,
yeah, particularly for what we call class 2 or apartment construction. Freestanding houses, not so much, but yeah, it's got a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult. And I think that historically, when I started at Breathe, I tried to prosecute everything indiscriminately. So I tried to solve everything right down to what the carcass material is made of in the joinery, to design out formaldehyde or melamine or whatever that was, through to electrification and specifying renewables. And I would treat them all with the same level of importance, And so what would happen is that my clients would be fatigued. They couldn't prioritize what was important. They didn't know what was important. And also I think that my mistake about doing that at Breathe Architecture was that Breathe was seen as a sustainability evangelist and as a hippie firm out on the edges. It was very niche. And so what I've learned over time is that if we actually care about the planet, we need to mainstream sustainability and we need to mainstream housing, and housing is a basic human right. And so I probably spent the last 5 years thinking about what are the important things and prioritising those, and then accepting if I can just get the important things through, particularly in a massive cost escalation environment, then that's okay. So I guess that I've become more willing to accept progress over perfection. Historically, in all the Nightingale buildings, we used to specify recycled timber floors. We would lift floors, or we'd get them from the buildings, we'd put them in, great carbon story, they've already paid down their carbon debt. We'd top nail them, not glue them. We'd finish them with a wax finish, and at the end of the building's life, in 100 or 150 years, they can be relifted and reused again. And so treated as this incredible resource. Really beautiful, right? Absolutely very difficult when you're rolling out 200 apartments. When you're doing 20, it's okay, it's hard. When you're doing 200, it's really difficult. If you're going to do 500, it becomes, incredibly challenging. Because what I've come to learn is about, the cost of money over time and what that means for housing. And also, the type of labour on site, labour on site, incredibly expensive. So we need to have a pre-finished floor coming in. So instead now we're specifying pre-finished cork. It's still a carbon sequester, it's pre-finished, but it's virgin, not recycled. Still got a great carbon story, but we've had to just accept that the things that we used to do in the smaller Nightingales that would make them seem so incredibly beautiful and domestic just cannot keep up. So I think that's what I've learned. And also, what's the biggest thing that everyone can do that doesn't seem niche? And so for us, the electrification piece and the buying 100% renewables, I've just been leaning into that super hard. I just keep on talking about that, trying to get every architect in the country understanding that if they're the only two things you can do, these are the things you have to do. And I'll take that, and that can solve 2/3 of your carbon, even if you're building a shitty curtain wall building that's not that energy efficient. At least sort out your electrification and where your electrons are coming from. I know that sounds like I'm giving up, but I just want the market to do the simple things first.
It seems like you're making trade-offs, which is inherent in development, right? We can't have it exactly what we want because there's factors outside of our control. But I think being able to weigh the opportunities and the cost seems to be critical.
And yet you're achieving a very high level of design, I think. It's very appealing. In common sense in real estate, when we talk about design, people equate that with high end. Well, that's going to be super expensive. But you seem to be achieving that balance with the cost as well. What's your secret?
I mean, you guys both trained as architects, right? And you're both working in development, so you both get this. So I know that this is a question you both know the answer to. But the funny thing is that some developers don't value design, Yet they all drive nice cars. And the reason that they drive those cars is because there has been an incredible amount of design put into that. You would never buy a car that hasn't been designed. Yet it's interesting that people think that you can buy building or housing without it being designed. And so what comes through that design process is that we're all systems thinkers, right? And the incredible thing about architects and architecture education is that we're taught to think through complex systems and find elegant, curated solutions to those. And so the Nightingale promise of a sustainability of reductionism is also an opportunity for cost reduction. So let's step through some of those ideas. We design out the car park, great. We save $100,000 a door, great. We design out all the carbon, great, but we also get people to come in through the front door. We take some of those savings, we build these seats, some beautiful landscape at the front entry. We might give back some floor area to the street, widen the street, put some planting in there, some place to engage with the broader community. It's a great outcome, but it's still way cheaper than building the basement. In the apartments, we take out the laundry, we save $6,000 or $7,000, we put that in the roof, and then we spend some money on building a beautiful rooftop and a beautiful laundry. And let's call that a cost-neutral exercise by the time you build the beautiful rooftop laundry. But it means that your building means something to the people that live there. Yeah. Just by the fact of the matter that you're not putting a penthouse on the roof, that you're putting shared facilities on the roof. Around that laundry, we put a kind of a shared a barbecue area, a dining area. It might be a little work from home space up there, some kids play stuff, and lots of biodiversity to try and deal with a pretty tough urban environment in parts of Melbourne. We also work with very good landscape architects, understanding that it's key to the success of our buildings. In the apartments themselves, we design out all the second bathrooms. Like in the US, there's a love affair with bathrooms in the Australian real estate market. Mm-hmm. So 1 bathroom per 2-bedroom apartment, and 1.5 bathrooms for a 3-bedroom apartment. We take out a bathroom and we save about $36,000 off the price of the apartment. We put 6 or 7 square meters back into the living area, so the living area becomes significantly bigger, and we save all the carbon that goes into building a bathroom and all the stuff that goes into it. Then we take out things like the ceilings. So if we're building an apartment out of post-tension concrete, we basically get an extra foot of ceiling height in there. And then when we expose the underside of the concrete soffit, it's imperfect, right? You can see the formwork, but it's got this archaeology of construction. It's beautiful. I mean, for us as architects, we all love it. But also when we expose that concrete, we're exposing the thermal mass. So we design our buildings ideally to try and be cross-ventilated, and means that we can use the thermal mass like a wine cellar to be able to control our internal temperature. We design our buildings to be highly thermally efficient, and we shade our glazing for us in the north, in the southern hemisphere, and from the west to deal with the afternoon sun, which can be very hot in Melbourne. And so we get this kind of thermal envelope that works really well, very, very comfortable, stable apartment with this kind of beautiful high ceiling. To do that, when you take out and you save all the carbon and all the cost from all of the plasterboard, all of the furring channels, all the stud adhesive, all the suspension systems. It means that you have to curate all the services that sit above that. So as architects, we get actively involved. We take it off the services engineers, and we curate where the fire sprinklers runs go, where the exhaust systems from the bathroom and the kitchens run. So we curate all of those things. So that you can see all of those things, but they're we use the services as decoration almost, right? So it's just well curated. And then we take reductionism right through to materials, right? So when we specify door hardware or tapware, we work with local manufacturers and we get them to pull the door hardware and the tapware off the production line before it goes to the chrome platers. So a company here called Sussex makes tapware locally out of recycled brass in an induction furnace with their massive solar array on their roof. They make carbon neutral tapware. They send us the brass taps with no coating on it, right? So it's just like raw brass. And so it starts off shiny and then it gets patinaed over time and it gets more beautiful over time, but there's not this energy hungry, toxic chroming process which goes onto that. So this level of imperfection that comes with Nightingale, but it also seems quite crafted. So the Japanese might call it wabi-sabi. High-end developers would say it's just crap building finishes, but for our residents, it actually shows you how the building is put together. I think it's really crafted.
Yeah, it sounds like you put less is more close to your heart.
100%. And we think through everything on that. And if we can put a surface in there that doesn't require a coating, so at the end of the building's life, it can be recycled or reused, we're very interested in designing that into or out of the building. And so we're winning on cost. And I think that we're winning on building something that looks meaningful. And the fascinating thing is that how this aesthetic has now become, I would say, mainstreamed in Melbourne. So there's so many apartments now being delivered without ceilings, which is this great outcome, right? So gypsum,
that's real impact right there.
All this gypsum's getting designed out, all this carbon's getting saved, and everyone's getting more volume in their apartments. It's very interesting to see. I think you're right, Alex, that the interesting thing is that we do these things, we show what's possible, and I think that we give people like banks and developers the confidence that they can put money into these projects, that they will still be able to sell them, they will still be able to fund them, they will get their money back at the end of the day. So I think that we're a bit of an R&D project to some extent for other developers.
What do you say to those types of people who want to get involved, who want to make a change, but don't see necessarily an existing pathway out in front of them? What does it take to get there and to make those changes as you guys have done over the past decades?
Oh, look, I think the incredible thing is that the US represents the best and the worst of capitalism. I mean, like some of the philanthropy that comes out of the United States is incredible, right? Some of the things that happen because of people with money doing interesting and great and bold things. I would say, Nightingale was just an idea, right? I wrote a manifesto and I asked people to come and put money into it. And in the first project, there were 6 architects, but 21 other people that all put money into doing the first Nightingale. So I think that if you have a bunch of people that want to do something about it, I would ask them to put their money where their mouth is. So if they're able, and it might be $10,000, and maybe it's investing $100,000, but we got 27 to put in $100,000 each to build Nightingale 1, and it has seismically shifted the way that housing is delivered in this state, and it has ripples up and down kind of the east coast of Australia. So yeah, I think, and you think about the states, there's 25 million people in Australia, there's 300 million people in the states. Think about, cities, states like California, states like Massachusetts and New York, like there are people there that are very interested in doing great things. So I would say get people together and use capitalism to do something great and big and bold and optimistic and naive. I would say just jump in.
Yeah, we all come back and say just do it. And I think we need a sponsorship from Nike at this point.
Well,
first of all, Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I think you've tied together all these different things that are imbued in your projects so clearly for us. Taking a step back, we like to ask all of our guests this final question, which is, I think we all acknowledge we're in a moment of a lot of transition. A lot of things are shaking out uncertainly, but we run this podcast because we want to take stock of the moment we're in right now. And one way we do that is by asking our guests, if we were to look back in the future, if we were to look back at the time we're in at the moment, how will we describe it?
I think we're going to be amazed at how blind we were. I think that, it's I just find it fascinating to see, 13,000 architects in this country continuing to build and not fighting tooth and nail for sustainability. That development managers and project managers work in this space and they're not fighting tooth and nail for sustainability. I don't understand. We all know about climate change, and yet we just continue every day. To be totally honest, Alex, I don't understand. I don't understand why we don't just fight way harder for that. And I think that we are going to look back. And for us, we're going to be, more for me, I'm 52. When I look back, I'm going to be older. It's not going to be such a big deal for me, but I think for you guys, for your kids, it's not just going to be me looking back. I think everyone's going to be looking back saying, what were they doing? So I think, I don't want to leave this on a bad note, but we've all got to do better. We've all got to fight, and we've got to fight every day for this stuff. Otherwise, nothing else matters. Sorry.
I think the tenor of your work demonstrates that we can do things successfully. We can make them beautiful, we can make them affordable, and we can make them sustainable as well. So I think with that, recognizing the challenge of the time just means stepping up and providing those solutions. So yeah. I just want to thank you, Jeremy, so much for joining us and sharing the story of Nightingale and sharing your own journey through this path. I think there's a lot of people out there who are trying to figure out a better way, and it's relieving to know that some people out there like yourself have figured out a pathway forward to relieve some of the issues when we talk about sustainability, inequality, affordability, all the things that really affect how we come together as human beings and live on this world together.
But also, Alex, thanks so much. Minkoo, thanks for connecting a while ago. Alex, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. And thanks for the opportunity. But also, I just want to say, I'm not particularly smart. I don't have a big IQ, struggled to get into university. And literally, it was just optimism and naivety that landed me in Nightingale. So I think that if we know what we should do, stop building the business plan, stop worrying about how you're going to do it, just commit to doing it, and you'll find a way. So my request to your listeners, to you all out there, is just have faith in yourself, right? That you've got this far, that you'll find a way. Just step into it and find a way to do something that's important.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
모스트 포던 팟캐스트